ये है ना बहुत बार रखना चाहते हैं मुझे कि आप यहाँ भी अपने आप को आज़ाद मानते हैं, हम यहाँ भी आपको मैं रेजिडेंशियल एरिया में रहता है, रोजाना मैं इंडिया वैसे तो अगर आप बगैर परमिशन हो आप खड़े नहीं हो सकते इन्वेस्टिगेशन का कोई पॉइंट ना हो, किसी को ऐसे उसकी प्राइवेसी को भी नहीं कर सकते।
So, welcome everyone. I was waiting for our viewers online. Also, warm welcome to them. So, we're here today to discuss Side and Genocide, but I would like to give the first words to our chairman, Mr. Satman Sital from Global Human Rights Defense. So, a warm applause for him, please.
First of all, I thank all the speakers that are here to give us some very in detail insight information, and I'm proud that we are here again, that we can support organizations that facing this terrible and extreme human rights violation that always surprised me, that how humans can be so cruel against each other. And as an organization, we don't have this experience, so our task is almost to support our organizations in the region. I'm from Suriname, so we have different problems, but not so extreme. I never had this experience before. And that's why we are all committed, and we have a very young team. I think the oldest is me, and then the youngest is, then second is you. So this is our strength, that we have a lot of young people, almost 80, that are working constantly for human rights reporting and human rights advocacy. And so they all are working for the organizations that need help. And we want to support them in extent, and we want to do all activities. And as we want to inform also the Western organizations in the West what is happening. Because we are trying to have our event to invite as much as diplomats, people from the Netherlands, in which we want to inform them the proper information that Balochistan is not part of Pakistan. West Turkestan is not part of China. Tibet is not part of China. So we are this kind of statement is accepted by the West, that we all think that Tibet was from China and that West East Pakistan, Turkestan was always from China. So let's try to get this information across the world. I also want to remember one person in my organization, that was our very respected secretary, Mr. Mahbuma. He just suddenly not more in our organization, and we listen every time. Every event, I think he was the person behind all this finance and lobbying network. He was also very prominent. He was the chairman of the Outsider London, and then he joined GHR. So this is, I think, for him to give him, let's say, the final. We have to continue also our work, but I want to just share to you that this is a person who was also the strength behind our organization. Thank you so much, and I'm very eager to listen to the. Not eager, I just want to have more background information so we can work more aggressively. Because there's time that we cannot just be talking, we need to be more aggressive. And that is the only way to bring some difference in and clear information to the West. Thank you so much.
I would just like to say a couple of words, and I'm not going to take too much time because I think we're all more waiting for the panelists to speak. We just wanted to highlight Global Human Rights Defense once we're here, a project that is very important to us. And would you mind? Thank you. So our work is based on 4 pillars, and I'm going to talk about one of them, which is one of the projects which is kind of combining all these 4 aims that we have. That project is called GHR TV. It's our TV news channel, under ghrtv.org, which is why you have all these camera people running around here and the camera set up and the live stream set up on GHR TV. That's why I wanted to highlight it. Please keep an eye out. This is our project to highlight human rights violations around the globe with a special targeted platform. All of the young people that you see here that Mr. Sital introduced, all of us with the name tags, we're responsible either for the social media that you see online, for the live stream, for the website, or some of us for the research teams. We have people here today representing the International Justice Team, the Middle East team, Team Pakistan. I hope I don't forget anyone because otherwise I get the Women's Rights Team. Thank God I live there. All of them are here and they answer all of your questions if you want at the networking later on. Now, I'm done. I can introduce you to the moderator of the day, my colleague Alessandro Cosmo, the Vice Director of Global Human Rights Defense. You're in good hands.
Thank you all for being here. There's not much more to say about me. I'm Alessandro, and I am the Vice Director of Global Human Rights Defense. I'd like to get right into it and invite our panelists up. Firstly, I'd like to invite Dr. Rubina Greenwood. Thank you. Rubina is the president and founder of the International Sindhi Women's Organization and chairperson of the World Sindhi Congress. Her 20+ years of human rights advocacy focuses on human rights issues and minority rights in Pakistan and Sindh. Secondly, I'd like to...
I'm going to...
Oh, thank you. This is me. And yeah, as a matter of fact, we have slides for each panelist. So this is Dr. Greenwood. Thank you for being here, Rubina. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Fanny Iona Mora. Fanny is a project and program coordinator at the Swiss Tibetan Friendship Association. She's also a researcher and author of Whispers of the Land of Snows, Culture-Based Violence in Tibet. This study looks at violence against Tibetans committed by the PRC and relates it to genocide through testimonials of Tibetans who have found asylum in Switzerland. She has also worked for UNHCR and the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development. Thank you for being here. Thirdly, I'd like to introduce you to Ms. Drin Abdullah. Right here, please. Thank you for being here. Drin is a young Balochistan activist and member of the Baloch National Movement. We are very excited to have such a young and motivated perspective contribute to our conversation today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And finally, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Nasir Dashti, a well-known panelist with GHRD. Dr. Dashti is an author who lives in exile in the United Kingdom after his internationally renowned works were declared blasphemous by the Pakistani government. Today, Dr. Dashti continues his important work in advocating for Baloch people's rights throughout Europe. Thank you for being here. Thank you all. I apologize, it's hard to read and transition at the same time. But anyway, because we're tight on time, I'd like to jump into a kind of a starting point, and anyone who feels compelled to answer, please do so. As you can see on the screen, we've quoted Article 6 of the Rome Statute of the ICC, which defines genocide under international criminal law. The definition of genocide, as per the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, is any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethical, racial, or religious group as such. I would like to highlight three of the elements of this crime. Firstly, killing members of the group. Secondly, letter D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And E, forcibly transferring children of the group, to another group. How does your respective regional focus fall within this definition? So basically, anyone who can contribute on whether their study falls within this definition, whether it encompasses the problem your people face enough. Would anyone like to contribute? Please.
Genocide in the legal sense for Tibet has not been recognized. Now the legal committee for the investigation of the question of Tibet in 1960 declared that acts of genocide were committed in Tibet. And through my research, I strongly believe that acts of genocide are continuing. Now, it can also be argued that the violence in Tibet meets the criteria for genocide laid down in the Article 2 of the Convention, regarding notably the mass deaths and mass killings of Tibetans and of prominent community of religious leaders, acts of tortures and other cruel treatment or punishment, the intentional infliction of emotional distress, the infliction of unsustainable working and economic conditions, notably on nomads and former political prisoners, and the separation of children from their families to educate them in a non-Chinese environment. We should also mention China's policies aimed at effecting demographic change, especially in Tibet, East Turkestan, and in Mongolia. Of course, the list is really not exhaustive.
Thank you. Yeah, something we wanted to highlight in this legal definition of genocide is any governmental effort to, or individual's effort to affect demographic change, which I think is something Tibet, Sindh, Balochistan people all are facing. It's something particularly difficult to prove. Is this Dr. Greenwood or Rubina? Is there anything maybe you could add?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously it's one thing I would like to say that the case of Sindh is not legally proven or considered by international community as a genocide case, but it has got all the, actually from A to E, all the elements cover the situation. And if I can go through one by one, but of course I'm not a legal lawyer, the lawyer has to decide, but I can give you the situation on all those points. So the killing members of the group, obviously you can see that extrajudicial killing is very common in Sindh, especially Sindh nationalist activists who talks about their rights, talk about the resource right, talk about the jobs, the basic amenities, and they fit under the category of A. The number B, which is causing seriously bodily or mental harm. The environment which is created in Sindh at the moment, last 70 years by Pakistan, is completely that it's a racial behavior towards Sindhis. So it's not necessarily, it's just a criminalization, but it's a racial element as well. It's treated Sindhis as a low-grade citizens who cannot decide about themselves, about their role in the country, or how they know they've been treated as that they cannot govern themselves, they cannot educate themselves, so there needs to be a powerful establishment sitting in the north can come around and actually dictate the Sindhis and how to rule themselves. So that's sort of, it's created the environment for the community and the nation is deprivations. Inferior complexes have been introduced through the institutional practices. And then number C, which is inflicting on the group conditions of life, physical destruction. I can give a list of that physical destruction. I think that fundamental is that when our nation's children are deprived from the education, deprived from the basic amenities, basic living conditions is so poor that survival is a struggle. So at the moment, Sindh is one of the richest states in the Pakistan, richest province of Pakistan, has got 69% GDP of Pakistan. And our 70% population lives under the poverty line, according to UN calculation. Before the flooding, I'm going to come on the flooding as well, but before the flooding, 80% of population of Sindh had no access to the fresh water. 30% of population is only have access to education, and especially the women are the worst affected in the community. So just imagine the nations where the mothers and the women of the nations are so deprived from the basic amenities. How can you imagine a nation to be a healthy nation or not? I can go on this topic, but just covering the point is that talking about forcefully transferring children to the room, this is a fundamental thing. The day Pakistan was born, the day from that, Sindhi medium language schools were shut down. We were forced, our children were forced into the brainwashing to identify themselves into the Pakistani phenomena, Islamization, and just forget about the rich cultural history of Sindh. And I think it's very fundamental. It's our psyche, our grandchildren are not identifying at the moment themselves as a Sindhi because they've been brainwashed. Their curriculum has been brainwashed completely. So it is a complete force on our young generation to identify themselves as somebody different than what they are originally. Thank you. And I'll let Laura decide.
No, you couldn't fool me. No, you touched on a number of interesting topics there. Just kind of canceling the Sindh population at all institutional levels. The right to education, the fear of identifying as a Sindh, and really kind of affecting memory. I would like to kind of go deeper on one point you raised, which was the human rights situation for women in Sindh. And maybe if I could switch over to you, Julie, and discuss as a young woman, offering a perspective to the conversation on Baloch, what it's like to be a Baloch woman under the current circumstances. Not only just a woman, but also a woman like yourself, trying to, at the very beginning of her life.
Yeah. As Dr. Bina already mentioned, that whatever happening right now in Pakistan under the oppression of military, actually we fit all of these criteria very well, because the import disappearance is such a various and variety of topics that we can talk about. First, I think what you asked about women, and as she mentioned, I lived in Karachi, Sindh, so I had to move, my ancestors has to move from their motherland to get better education because, or maybe better living conditions itself. So they had to move to Karachi, and as a young person, as a young female, I went to school. And for the first day when I had to go to school, it was a private school that had to teach me Urdu, the national language. When I spoke my mother language, they had to fine me. I had to pay money for that. If I had to speak with my younger siblings, my mother tongue, I had to pay money for that. It's just a simple example of how they want us to forget who we are and how much oppressed we are because of that one nation. That it's just problematic for me to that if we call it a silent genocide, because it is not silent. It tells you so many stories, so many questions for every part of these criteria. As you talk about the women, I think we need to mention that with enforced disappearance and silent genocide, most of the affected people are women. Because first in that society, we really actually has to be with a man to survive there. And with my women is that, of course, we see the problem of enforced disappearance when their male significant other is gone from the house and the female has not someone that can provide them. But with the general hygiene products, for example, it's such a taboo for us to talk about because we are not given the proper right education. Because we're such oppressed, we're not giving the right modern or at least the updated version of education for women. As you mentioned that we sometimes get the books of Sindh board. I lived in Sindh. In Balochistan, you don't get much of education. Once there are buildings, there might not be teachers. If there are teachers, you cannot find students because we don't trust the governmental schools there because you can find books of 1990s
and such an old school version of books that you can never trust with the facts. And even if we get a school, the teachers are not really capable to teach anything. So women, I think, is not only being oppressed by in-court disappearance of their significant other, like father, like husband, or even their sons, but overall the criteria that we fit in, it's really problematic to think that it's a silent genocide, because it tells you stories of so many different ways of the same genocide that Pakistan is doing, not only in Baloch, not only in Sindh, because Pakistan contains so many different cultures and so many different nations into one nation that was never been a cultural background. It was always a too religious point of view that has been forced for people to become one, which can never be possibly done, because we even though we lived in Sindh, I lived in Sindh, I spoke a different language, I wore different clothes, I hang out with different people. How can you expect us to be one when we are currently not? We can never be. You want us to forget our identity? We can never do that. My mother speaks to me in my language. I can never forget that. And I think it's important to know that. Thank you.
Can I come back? Please. I'm sorry. I just, for the audience, is to understand that at the moment, Pakistan's national language is Urdu. We respect all languages and diversity. That's not about it. But the key fundamental point is to recognizing that indigenous languages, native languages and mother tongue languages and their culture and their heritage is the most important psychologically for a child to have been able to speak in their own mother tongue, gives us some sort of encouragement and confidence. I think here what we are talking about is that Pakistan is trying to impose the language which doesn't belong to any of the nations who are unfortunately part of the Pakistan at the moment. I think that's the very need to be clear there. And that's why we're talking about it, is this mental slow genocide, is when you wipe out the psychology, wipe out the mother tongue and the heritage and culture, how it affects other people. And then story goes from that. You start in the end of the other issues. Thank you.
No, thank you. Yeah, I think something that really resonates with what you three have said so far is this forcing forgetfulness, which is really something scary, I think, trying to forget your own identity and being forced to do so. I'd like to do two things. First, I'd like to circle back to a point you raised about kind of taboo around women's needs. Not only taboo around speaking your own language, but whatever language you're speaking in, speaking about, women's needs, whether it's hygiene products or women's rights in general. Before we get to that, I would like to quickly pose a question to Dr. Dashti, if I may. One of the reasons GHRD is visiting Geneva this week is to sit in on the 51st Human Rights Council session to report on the different items of debate and their findings. In your experience, as we've just met in Geneva before, do you think that institutions like the UNHRC are an effective means of denouncing and combating silent genocide? If not, what can NGOs like GHRD do to bring unnoticed cases of mass persecution like those we are discussing today to international attention? That's a long-winded question to ask. Is the UN an effective means of making your case?
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
I will answer your question, but first, as someone said, this is not a silent genocide going on in Pakistan. It is very, very noisy genocide.
Exactly.
And I don't know what the people they define killing or murder. Murder doesn't mean only to end one's life. For a nation, for a people, eliminating their language, eliminating their culture, eliminating their history is more than killing physically. And to me, culture, identity, language, traditions, without these, a people or a nation is without soul. We can observe the phenomena of the indigenous people of America and Australia. They are still living. They can eat, they can drink, they have their houses. But they are dead in a sense that they don't know their languages, they don't know about their gods, they don't know about their traditions, they don't know how their ancestors were sometime walking down in their land. So, first, killing is not only physical. Killing involves cultural, economic, historical. Someone was saying, Dr. Rovina was saying, everything in Pakistan is based on lies, including history. They are mutilating our history beyond recognition. So, whether the UNHCR, the proper forum, or UN is doing anything to highlight the human rights violation or genocide, this is relative because who is running UN? Who are the policy makers of the United Nations? When the West was financing United Nations, the United Nations was observing human rights violation where there is an interest of the Western countries. And now, when China and Saudi Arabia are main contributors to the UN, they see human rights violation where Chinese interest or some way interest of other people are involved. But it doesn't mean that we should abandon our efforts, the UNHCR or other forums in the United Nations, because we don't have any other option. Whether they listen to us or not, we have to cry. We have to raise our voices. United Nations is not an independent organization. So I think that to move United Nations in a particular way, we have to reach out those powers or countries who are controlling the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you for that. You brought up a lot of interesting points, and it's hard to be a moderator and go in one direction because there's a bunch of different topics I'd like to unpack. You say, we cannot abandon our work because we do not have another option. No matter how hard we sit here and criticize the UN, there's nothing else to do in that regard. There needs to be, awareness needs to be raised. What I would, I know a number of you have been in the field of human rights advocacy for a very long time. Could any of you maybe discuss any development you've seen any change, not necessarily development, but change you've seen over time, kind of within this definition of genocide? Dr. Rin, please.
So, I absolutely support what the person said, because at the moment UN is dominated by the states which were outcome of World War II, artificial rapid countries which were formed in rush to stabilize the international peace. So I have no problem with that, but it has a problem like people like us who are underrepresented, who are the same as people, right? But as Darshi Saab said, that we have to work within what we have got, right? So yes, I haven't seen the change because I've been working in UN since the age of 20s and 30s. I haven't seen change, but recently I've seen a couple of things which I would like to talk to with you team as well, is that UN General Secretary has got now 2 advisors. One which is called the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, and then this is a second one, Special Advisor on the Responsibility to Protect the People. These are the 2 new advisors has been introduced recently. And I think that's about the time for us to, or the people who really genuinely believe in our cause, is to actually lobby those individual advisors or advisors' offices, really. These are the new element has been recently introduced. Again, infiltration is very common. Pakistan, our enemy, is extremely powerful in Geneva, extremely powerful in New York, and extremely powerful in all other institutes in the United Nations. But that doesn't mean we should sit down. We as said, we need your help to lobby the countries who fund the United Nations, for number one. That is important. And second, that these new instruments and new mechanisms which has been introduced during the whole time, we need to actually take those hold, and these are the new mechanisms. So it's really timely if we work on those. There's a third thing has come up, which I heard this morning actually, is that every year now, human rights report is being published by General Secretary, which takes the 1 year's extrajudicial killing in the recent. And I think if we could mention, especially the Baloch casualties and Sindh casualties on those reports, it challenges every year to the countries to respond to those atrocities. So there are a few things which we can actually work about problem. But of course, we need to think in a strategic way. And strategic way, which Dr. Saab said, we got to help you guys to help us to lobby those countries who fund. But now, unfortunately, at the moment, the biggest funder of the United Nations is China at the moment. Now, let's leave the questions, perhaps we can add on the China role.
Genocide.
Well, I mean, whatever you're comfortable, I have a question for you prepared, but please go ahead.
Just for a second, can I add something on what she said?
If I can, sorry, just interrupt for a moment. I'll take this opportunity. I forgot to mention it earlier. If you do have a phone, please make sure that it's silenced. Please.
So I think she made such an important impression on me for such questions because as a young person, to me, come to UN is such an honor. I see that because I think I am here to criticize this rather than being a fan of it. What I saw is that when I came here, what I had in my mind was completely different what I saw today in an event that was named for enforced disappearance. What I thought was, of course, diplomats sitting there with their perfect suits. I did kind of imagine that. But what I imagined is also a youth representation. Because we're talking about the future, the youth that is the future. I didn't see any youth representation in any panels. And when we talk about the enforced disappearance, we just gave 1 minute and 30 seconds, I guess. That was the minute to talk about such a violent crime in part of the world that for them it's just 130 seconds. It's the whole life for people. For me to come in such events, I think I'm here to criticize this more than anybody else because I am gonna be the future. And I don't want this in the future because I think it's just ridiculous to sit in those tables and give the countries 1 minute and 30 seconds to talk about their issues that is killing their future. If there is no man left in my country and the woman is being raped and killed, who is going to give birth to my next generation? Who I can be a politician for? How am I going to support that? When you talk about that if UN has changed, I have never been before here, but what I see now is it needs to change. It has changed, I don't know, but it needs to change in future at least. Thank you.
Thank you. You're making a very good point, and I think we could go further into kind of UN and international legal kind of approaches to these very serious issues. Feni, if I could go back to you, I'd love to expand more on cultural genocide and that term, applying it to your case study, Tibet. I would also be curious to know about kind of you once again touched on women's rights within this cultural genocide context, young women's rights, and how that how they're affected within this kind of strategic, if we could say that, genocide.
So you mentioned the term cultural genocide, and to be honest, I'm not so sure about the use of cultural genocide. The risk is that in addressing cultural genocide, we separate out Tibetans' cultural existence and their biological survival, when in reality both are intertwined. A genocide is a genocide and should be called as such. In my work, I will return to Raphael Lemkin's work. His conception of genocide is very important as it does not always entail the immediate destruction of the nation and its people. It should rather be seen as a process, a coordinated two-step plan of action aiming first to eradicate the national patterns of the oppressed group and then to forcibly assimilate this group by imposing the national patterns of the aggressor. The difficulty with the 1948 convention is that its text focuses on mass extermination on the biological level, overlooking Lemkin's concept on genocide, and notably the central cultural component of such violence. China has violently disrupted the natural process of cultural change in Tibet through forced cultural assimilation, which continues to engender violence. In Tibet, it implies the forced abandonment of a population to give up the cultural identity, notably their education, spirituality, arts, language, norms, and customs, to fit into China's. And the CCP does not hesitate to use violence to achieve its aims. I recall that the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples prohibited forced assimilation in international law. To prevent such forced cultural assimilation, it is crucial to recall that the CPK must guarantee the rights to freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of association as enshrined in international human rights law.
No, again, you touched on a number of interesting subjects. This cultural genocide is this notion that really hasn't been addressed by institutions like the UN and bodies of international law alike. Is something that we're seeing in all three of the focus areas that you guys are representing today. Dream brought up the fact that an oral submission at a UNHRC session is 1 minute and 30 seconds long, at best. We have meetings, we have Human Rights Council sessions, we have laws like this one. Is that enough to address cultural genocide? What can the international community do to address cultural genocide? And I'm looking at you, Feni, if you would like to answer, please do.
It's not enough. I think we should. Lemkin was actually one of the initiators of the convention, and he really spoke about cultural genocide and genocide. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, only the biological extermination of people was taken into account, and the cultural component of cultural genocide was just overlooked. Completely overlooked, and that was a huge mistake. That's why we see now so many violence that just are clear that just are very genocidal. I don't like using that word, but I want to say it's not at all. So I think it's actually the definition of genocide that should be worked on, and really to put the cultural component of it further.
Yeah.
Because it's clearly missing.
It's terrifying, and culture in itself is such a difficult thing to define. But we're seeing it in, again, all the cases you're bringing here today. What I would like to switch to, who I would like to switch to is Dr. Vashti, if I may. I was wondering if you could expand a bit on kind of your work as an author who's been labeled blasphemous. How does that affect your culture and kind of that of your people? these works you published, are they gone?
So many things have gone from our society, our traditions. Then we are a people, our nation, which is slowly but noisily being eliminated from the face of earth. We live in an area, 2,000 years ago, there were 7 major nations which were mentioned in Greek authors' reports on this area, who were accompanying Alexander the Great. Now, among those people which they termed as predators, because they resisted the march of the Greek army through their land, they termed them as predator nations. Among those 7 predator nations, only 2 are existing at the moment. One is Kurd, the other is Baloch. All other 5 are vanished. You can't find them in today's world, neither their language. Among these 2, Kurd, they are a little bit fortunate because of the conflict in the Middle East. Willingly or unwillingly, they have got some kind of autonomous region. And they are in a way able to preserve their language and traditions and history. But we, Baloch, we are being finely minced by the powerful jaws of at least 3 religious, fundamentalist, and rogue states for decades. In the West, there is Persian Islam. In the East, there is Pakistani Islam, and on the North, it is the Afghan fundamentalism. We can't teach our children Balochi in schools. There is no education for our children in Balochi, neither in Iran, nor in Pakistan, nor in Afghanistan. Our history has been mutilated to the extent that the Persian, they say, the Baloch are a sub-tribe of Persia. Pakistani course books are curriculum in schools and colleges. Until 3 years ago, they defined the Baloch as barbaric, brutal, inhuman group of people. That was in the official curriculum of school curriculum of Punjab, which is in practical terms Pakistan. Then in any book or curriculum in Iran and Pakistan, there is no mention that Baloch were, until they were occupied by the British in 1839. They were an independent nation. There was a country. They have their own way of life, whether they were poor, but they were walking tall on their deserts and mountains. you can't find any mention of the Baloch in the books. School curriculum. Our language is 3,500 years old, and our children are forced to learn a language which is 400 years old, which was developed in the red light areas and military camps of northern India. And this is our national language. There is nothing wrong with the languages. Languages are the medium of communication. We love each and every language. But it should not be at the expense of our mother tongue. Urdu is not our national language. Our nation is Baloch, and Balochi is our national language. But for the last 70, 75 years, our children are forced to believe that Urdu is their national language. Then there is the mutilation of history. There were, in medieval times, people from Central Asia, from West Asia, they grouped together, formed armies or banded. They invaded India. And on the way, they also massacred Baloch. There were genocides of the Baloch until they reached India or the Sindh. And these marauders, these invaders from Central Asia, whether they were Turco-Mongols, whether they were Persians, whether they were Arabs, they carried out genocide on our ancestors. And now our children are being forced to accept them as national heroes. Our children are being forced to write and glorify them in their exam papers. Then there is a cultural difference. Baloch are not Indians. We belong to the cultural traditions of Central Asia, Persian Plateau. But because of this cultural, linguistic, historical onslaught, now many of our old traditional values are being forcefully kept in the background. And I think if some person who died in 1948 or 47 came again to life, he will not, or she will not recognize where he or she is, whether he or she is among the Baloch or someone in another community. And then there is the economic genocide.
Sorry to interrupt you. We're just tight on time.
Okay.
So please carry on.
Then this economic genocide, we Baloch believe that our land is rich. We have everything of natural resources. But we are now the poorest of the poor. So all these things, I think this first part of the definition of the genocide, it includes all these things. Killing, whether you kill a language, whether you kill a cultural tradition, whether you mutilate the history of a nation, whether you kept economically backward a rich community, all these are killing of people or a genocide.
Thank you. That last point that I made right before a genocide, an economic genocide, was particularly powerful. I sincerely apologize to cut you off. Unfortunately, we're tight on time. I would like to ask for some closing remarks on 3 topics I collected from all four of you speaking. And then we have a special guest speaker who will speak briefly as well. But if I may, I really, it's a shame to have to cut this short. Unfortunately, the room is only booked for so much time. But some key points, at least I, and I'm sure our audience took away from you today, which I would then ask for you each to speak on with some of your own closing remarks, is that these genocides we're speaking about today may fall under this definition, but they also may not. But the most important thing to take away is that they are definitely not silent, and there's a very forced erasure of cultural identity and a forced forgetfulness of that very identity. I would also, I also picked up that we must revisit the international legal definition of genocide and pay closer attention at who is writing this, who are the lawyers writing these laws, who are the international policymakers labeling these different humanitarian atrocities. And finally, moving away from the UN, its institutions and its definitions of international law, it's very clear that there is a state of human rights that is simply unacceptable. Not only is it unacceptable, the very basic needs of women in these each individual kind of groups is unacceptable as well, in which you cannot speak on the very fundamental needs. So these are my 3 points. I would be grateful if each of you could kind of offer some closing remarks. Maybe Fanny, we can start with you and come down the line.
Yes, I was very often asked about the role of the CCP, why they actually go through such repression in Tibet. And I don't think it's possible to know exactly what the intent of the CCP is, what do they have in mind. But what we can see is that through its actions, policies, laws, the CCP is destroying in whole or in part the Tibetan people. The CCP denies Tibetans the right to exist as individuals and as a community in their own right. And in the medium to long term, it is the disappearance of the society that is at stake in Tibet. I would like to conclude with Lemkin, who explains that the destruction of a society or a nation, I quote, result in the loss of its future contributions to the world. Moreover, such destruction offends our feelings of morality and justice in much the same way as does the criminal killing of a human being. I thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fanny. It was very resonant to many of our cases as well. But I just want to be very clear that when it comes to the case for a traditional definition of genocide, we Sindhis, and of course Balochistan, fit in very well. Even for the killing part, unfortunately, extrajudicial killing is so prevalent in both nations that it doesn't need even the other forms of definition. So one wants to really emphasize that before we go into other parts of the definition, we just hit on the thing. It should be an international investigation on how many people are disappeared, how many people are killed in Sindh and Balochistan. But also, I mean, a systematic eradication and erosion of the cultures and nations is a classic example. For example, the Sindh is currently going through some of the worst flooding in Pakistan, a humanitarian crisis. And this is the second time after 2010 we had the same flooding, but it's a double now at the moment. Around 10 to 20 million people are affected, and it's not climate change. That the way Pakistan has presented is a climate change. It's not climate change. It's a poor management of Pakistani state, who actually got the funds from 2010, completely went to the military. They did not spend on infrastructure. They did not improve the drainage system, and they did not provide adequate rescue system. Till today, after 6 weeks of flooding, people are still stranded, and Pakistan has got one of the richest army in the world, still not provided the jets or helicopter to those people. And people are dying with hunger, people are dying with the diseases. Is that genocide? It is genocide. It's a clear, obvious genocide. We don't need to get into another definition. I don't need to present another case for it. I'm just saying you go into traditional form, and this is my case, and please help us out. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just to remember that why we are here today is that the genocide, just to remember the last 4 months, what happens in Balochistan. In April, 39 people were killed and 50 disappeared. And in May, it was 45 women and children and 20 killed. And then in June, it was 33 killed, 30 disappeared. In July, 40 disappeared, 48 killed. And in August, this last month, 30 killed and 36 disappeared. Do you think it's a silent genocide? For me, it's definitely not. And just for that, she mentioned a lot of things are happening right now. For that definition happened, I don't know, after World War II. And then when you remember that R2P, that is responsibility to protect, that I think is important to know that the definition of that is an international norm that seeks to ensure that international community never again fails to halt the mass atrocity crimes of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Are we seeing again for this? Is it happening right now? Or what are we doing right now? We need help. The governments are not helping. The Pakistan army is actually doing it because they want us to die. They want us to die and call it a climate change disaster, an extreme natural disaster. And we're not ready to accept that. I want to tell you today that it's not a climate change extreme, and it's properly systematic, planned genocide that is happening via the name of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Dashi, we will close this off.
I think there are two things. One is that the genocide, taking note of the genocide in our area or in another part of the world, is relative to the political interest of the powerful. It is not an isolated issue. Where there are interests of the powerful, a single event. There was a child who drowned on the beaches of Syria. There was an outcry which the world has never seen before, especially the Western world, because they were trying to topple the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad. And this they used not in the love of the Syrian people or the Kurdish Kurd. That was used as a political weapon to mobilize their masses, to make the public opinion in favor of intervention in Syria. So we should not put many hopes on these institutions. But as I said before, we have no other options. And we have to knock at their doors repeatedly, persistently. Perhaps things will change. Perhaps they may find some interest in our region, economic or strategic, and then they will take up the issue of our genocide. Otherwise, it will go on. Thank you.
Thank you. If I could invite the audience to a round of applause. Thank you, and I'd like to stress how serious these things are, and about 50 minutes is not enough to give them justice. We're fortunate enough to have someone close off our panel discussion, Mr. Jamil Maqsood, who is the Secretary of Foreign Affairs for the United Kashmir People's National Party. I would like to invite you up to wrap us up for the day.
Thank you very much for inviting me at this August panel discussion. It is an honor. After listening such a fruitful discussion on the practices of genocide, various shapes, whether it is the elimination of a particular group, or cultural genocide, also economic genocide is taken into account. Since I hail from Pakistani occupied Jammu Kashmir, until 1999, the international community has had very little knowledge about that region. It was behind the Iron Curtain. We do not have any media, no TV, there are no newspapers, and the local people were, and the international community was always relying on the newspapers published in the Islamabad or other. So Pakistan TV was showing that these areas are free, independent, prosperous. Imagine a region that contains only 4 million people and 1,700,000 are living abroad, and only 2.8 million people are living in that region. They are deprived of everything what is discussed by the fellow panelists, from Tibet to Sindh, from Balochistan. I endorse everything, each and every word which is spoken from this house today. And same is the case with us in Pakistani occupied Jammu Kashmir. We have two regions. One is directly controlled and one is indirectly controlled. But both have the same economical, political, cultural, constitutional, democratic deficits and marginalization. In this scenario, what should be done? Lobby, advocacy, and more lobbying and more advocacy. In the international institutions, like in Britain, like in the United States, in New York, or in Brussels, European Parliament, European Commission, and also in Geneva, where they have Human Rights Council. So this is a constant struggle, constant work, genocide. We deprive our future generations from their mother tongues, from their cultures, from their traditions, and everything that is rich. And alien culture and alien language and alien traditions and alien things are being enforced on them. So in this scenario, the international community should come forward, and it is our responsibility to herald them, to tell them. And in this regard, we should ask Britain, because Pakistan is a grandchild of Great Britain. So since a large Pakistani, a Baloch, Sindhi, Kashmiri diaspora is living in London, in Britain, why we are not loving there? That it is your creation, and under your creation, we are suffering that much. We have been destroyed from top to bottom and bottom to top. So if we are the people, we are the members of the international community, if we are counted in 7 billion population of this world, where are our fundamental human rights that are enshrined by the United Nations Human Rights Declaration, International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and many other, like Rome Statute and many other conventions? So where do we fall? Are we human beings or not? If yes, then it is your responsibility to press Pakistan and press all those who deprived Sindhis, Baloch, Pashtuns, Kashmiris, and the people of Balochistan from their land, their resources, their culture, their languages, and everything that belongs to them. So once again, thank you very much for this wonderful event.
Thank you for being here. All right. Well, once again, thank you to our speakers. Thank you to Mr. Maksud. GHR TV would now like to invite you to a reception we have right across the hall. We'd love to discuss any and all topics further. Unfortunately, we did not have time for a Q&A session, but all questions can be discussed again right across the hall. I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you to those online. And thank you. Have a good
Yeah, could I just say GHR and all Alexander, Nina, and the whole team. You've done a wonderful job.